This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show where we explore the miraculous nature of the mundane as we look at one part of the Catholic tradition to help you engage more fully in the practice of faith. Past episodes are available at renovopodcast.com. I'm Doug Tuke, and today a topic that no one really pays attention to, that doesn't really shape your modern mind: politics and Catholics. Because this is fun, right? What are we not supposed to talk about at the dinner table? Bring it on. If you're a group of people that listen to this podcast, I hope this spurns an awesome conversation for you. I hope there's like drinks flying and you're like wrapping around the table, because to be honest with you, I am so frustrated with the right and the left that has penetrated the core of Catholic believers, as if we could ever ally ourselves with any political ideology. So that's what this show is about. But I will warn you, I'm not going to talk about my politics at all. I'm going to talk to you about history and just kind of what the church is, where it's been, kind of where it's going, and maybe throw down some good, just challenging discussion points for you. I look forward to your emails. Okay, so something to think about, okay? Catholics in American politics has a super long history, all right? Yet, here's the thing. It's really overshadowed by kind of the present disunity, okay? So there's this Christendom College professor, Christopher Shannon, and he gave a really good interview to the Catholic News Association years ago. Well, not too long ago, actually. It was during this presidency. And I'm going to borrow like a lot from that interview because his language is so good. So something to think about. Christopher Shannon, he says this. He says, "This rupture in the church and the change in American politics has only hardened divisions within the church." He continues, "What frustrates me or troubles me is that they seem to be more concerned about where's our country going than where's our church going." That is a great line, okay? And at the core of the show and any political discussion you have with Catholics, you should ask that question. Are you more concerned about where our country is going or where the church is going? And in the wake of the recent abuse scandal, all the news and everything, you really should ask that question, because there are bigger issues in terms of eternity than the local economy. And I hope that's hard for you to wrap your mind around. Okay, so Professor Shannon, he says, here's the thing. He says, they seem to be way more comfortable and happy to work for a better America with liberal friends or conservative friends than to really restore unity in the church. He finishes, he says, the political divisions in the church have only hardened and worsened the theological divisions and division in general. That's a great assessment. So here's something for us to remember, listeners, especially. Prior to the 1960s, you got to understand that the unity that people see in the church was also kind of reflected in political unity, okay? Catholics, we've always had like our little nitpicky infighting, but we could see ourselves as united people in the church. Also because we were somewhat united in our politics, and I'm talking about in the U.S., of course, okay? So let's do a little bit of history. So Catholic politicians always been a minority, okay? Always a minority, but they have a really long history in the U.S. Maryland's Charles Carroll, for example, was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. But by the mid-19th century, kind of the average Catholic in America was pretty much an immigrant or poor. So unlike Europe, there's no Catholic party had emerged. Okay, there was no Catholic party in the United States. So for Professor Shannon, he says Archbishop John Hughes of New York, who headed the Archdiocese 1842 to 1864, basically came closest to creating a Catholic politics in the 19th century. He would never have considered himself to be acting as a Catholic politician, but his actions, okay, regarding the public school system definitely had a political edge. So the public school system was pretty much de facto Protestant, with religious education based on reading the King James Version of the Bible. Again, that's in public schools. Now, Catholics objected to this, and bishops kind of sought that Catholics could be excused from reading the Protestant Bible. So the Archbishop's stand was simply based on, quote, self-preservation and defense of his community. Now, according to Professor Shannon, he says Archbishop Hughes, he did start a political party over the issue to split the Democratic Party vote in New York politics, but he eventually resolved the whole controversy by starting a Catholic school system. There were no, which obviously educated kids in a different way. And even today, the Catholic school system in New York, it's monstrous. It's facing its own financial dilemmas, but it's huge. Okay. There were no Catholic politicians in the 19th century that were really even close to the stature of Archbishop Hughes. That's a big deal. So rather, it's kind of folks played smaller roles in influencing networks in New York City's Tammany Hall and other places. So you got to understand, such like Catholic politicians that wanted to influence any kind of like legislature, not a lot of the principle that we think of in the modern sense, but really needed to be very much a man of the people. Like they were not leading with their Catholic politics. Okay. Professor Shannon, he says this, he says, these type of politicians have a bad reputation today for their corruption and such. But for them, politics was about delivering the goods and not about high principles. He says, the widow Murphy needs coal or she will freeze to death. Old Joe Riley, he can make sure she got coal. Very much deliver the goods, get the thing done, not just look good doing something, but get it done. So Catholic politics really through the 19th century, it was good enough. It was good enough for people to just get what they needed physically to survive. Again, Catholics coming from that poor and immigrant culture, that's a big deal. So now, at the time, there weren't a lot of Catholic principles that applied to any kind of democratic institutions. And this is really important to understand. So the church itself really had a lot of doubts about democracy. And this might be really hard for American Catholics. It's not necessarily hard for me. I don't want a democratic church. I really don't. I trust in the Holy Spirit. That's a whole nother conversation, but I don't want a democracy. I don't want to vote on everything. So to think, you got to open your mind here, pull your brain out of the modern world for just a second. The first social encyclicals aiming to engage the modern world or modernity, okay, in a positive way, had very little impact, okay, except for like a small but growing number of priests who used them to try to articulate a Catholic politics, okay? So most clearly, Monsignor John Ryan, who became especially prominent as an ally of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. That's a big deal. He was very outspoken about that. The venue for most Catholics was awful. It was very like geographically localized. So Catholic politics was urban politics. It was all urban. It was all about the political machines that ran the cities. And a lot of that is, of course, where our immigrants settled. So Irish immigrants especially dominated politics. They came largely kind of fluent in English, and their homeland was really politicized in the wake of like Catholic emancipation. So their dominance was at a time just resented by other Catholic groups, not to mention other Americans. We did a whole show on Irish Catholicism. You should check that out. So that'll really kind of unpack what that idea is. Now, let's talk about Al Smith. So Al Smith is probably the most famous next to Kennedy, and we'll get to him in just a second. Since the late 19th century, Catholics had become really a force in the Democratic Party. New York Governor Al Smith, a Democrat, became the first Catholic candidate for president in 1928. Now, Smith had come out of Tammany Hall, the Tammany Hall environment in New York. He was not considered corrupt. He was also really sympathetic to some of the concerns of the progressive era. So he saw a need for programmatic approach to social problems instead of like case by case acts of charity. He was a big picture guy. Smith was not necessarily directly influenced by the social teachings of the Pope, of the papacy. So at one point, actually a leading writer of The Atlantic, the magazine The Atlantic, challenged his candidacy and wondered his presidency could be like negatively influenced by papal encyclicals. And Smith says, he goes, what the hell is an encyclical? He was basically trying to develop a Catholic politics without calling it a Catholic politics. Okay. So I think the most important thing about Smith, it really kind of the contrast that he shows to Kennedy later is what he would say. Al Smith would say, I'm an American. I'm not trying to impose my faith on people. He would be attacked and attacked and attacked, but he would never back down from his commitment to the church and from identifying himself as a Catholic. That's a big deal. So for him, Catholic politics was a kind of like identity politics. He would say, I'm Catholic and I can be Catholic and American. I can be a Catholic and a good president. And I'm not going to renounce my faith by silence or by denying or ignoring my faith. So Smith, he seeks votes not for his religion, but for his political positions, and he failed to win the presidency. But his career, his peak as New York governor, was a tremendous step for Catholics in America, especially in politics. Okay, JFK, kind of a president who happened to be Catholic, very, very different than Al Smith. So the presidency of John F. Kennedy was another pretty watershed moment, right, for Catholics in the United States. He basically, in some sense, more through his assassination than his actual election, he puts to rest the idea that Catholics cannot be good citizens. And that sounds like a snarky comment, but the reality is you got to remember the derogatory nature of the immigrant culture that, not unlike today, the way we treat immigrants, and Catholics were considered immigrants, papists, who came to the country, brought their European ideology. And so it's a big deal. He was like, no, I am who I am, all the way up to the presidency of JFK. That's kind of amazing. However, so Kennedy's method of engaging the issue of the Catholic faith in politics was way different than Smith. Okay. So particularly in how he addressed the concerns of kind of those that were skeptical of a Catholic in the White House. Kennedy, in his September 12, 1960 speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, said, "I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens also to be Catholic." He said, "I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." And then he continued, "Whatever issue may come before me as president, if I should be elected on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject, I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be in the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressure or dictates, and no power or threat of punishment could cause me to decide otherwise." That's a big deal, because this really represents like Kennedy privatizing his Catholic faith. So his example, it kind of flowed into popular interpretations of the Second Vatican Council. So Professor Shannon says the church is not saying that your faith should be purely private, but it is endorsing what looks like an American model in terms of disestablishment and religious pluralism. That's a great line. So the big thing is, when Kennedy becomes this great martyr, Catholics feel they finally arrived. But on what terms? Like on whose terms? And the answer is on American terms, right? Not on the church's terms. So there's a division here. There's a separation. The immigrant Catholic population is accepted as Americans. They're not accepted as Catholic Americans. They're accepted as these, and you can see this playing out, the privatization of faith. It's a big deal. They're not accepted because as Catholics, they have something distinct to contribute to the country as Catholics, but they're accepted because of JFK, because all of a sudden he's shown his ability to navigate that world. That's a bold statement. Okay. Professor Shannon, he says, a politician like Smith would never have claimed to be a Catholic politician or to have the right to impose his faith on others. However, he would never have renounced the church in the way that Kennedy did. It was a matter of tone and style, two very different approaches. And again, go back to that language of privatization. So Kennedy's statement is kind of harsh. He could have taken the same stand without so strongly distancing himself. And those who say their faith has nothing to do with their politics, they have to answer this question: where do you draw your guidance from, right? Let's just sit with that for a second. Like, so what is inspiring your moral decision-making if it's not your faith, if it's not your relationship with where you worship? That's a big deal. Okay, let's talk about the situation after Vatican II. So with the example of Kennedy and a lot of popular interpretations of the Second Vatican Council, both conservative and liberal Catholics, they would cite what's called kind of the pluralistic nature of democracy as a reason to really privatize their faith. In other words, they start saying various positions are rooted in my faith and therefore they are private. So we really start to compartmentalize issues, political issues. So both liberal and conservative Catholics start making the distinction on all kinds of issues, even on abortion. The conservative writer William F. Buckley Jr. in March 1966 column, he claimed that the principal meaning of the Second Vatican Council was that other men must be free to practice their conscience, and if they do not believe abortion is wrong, then anti-abortion laws would contradict the church's position. That's an interesting statement. So that kind of distinction picks up a lot of momentum in the 60s and 70s, and it's given a real famous formulation by Mario Cuomo at Notre Dame as he's seeking national office, where he kind of makes a pretty famous statement. So in September 13th, 1984, a speech sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's Department of Theology, famous Mario Cuomo justified his pro-abortion rights position by saying Catholic public officials live a, quote, political truth, quote, which holds, quote, that to assure our freedom, we must allow others the same freedom, even if occasionally it produces conduct by them which we would hold to be, quote, sinful. Okay, Cuomo says, I accept the church's teaching on abortion. Must I insist you do by law, by denying you Medicaid funding, by a constitutional amendment? If so, which one? Would that be the best way to avoid abortions or to prevent them? That's the question he asked. That's interesting. Let's throw that on the table. Let's grab that sewer can and chuck it on the table for political conversation. So Professor Shannon, he kind of summarizes Cuomo's position. He says, personally opposed, but publicly agnostic. Isn't that an interesting line? Personally opposed, but publicly agnostic. So this governor says his duty as a public servant was to uphold the law of the land, but he does not give consideration to his ability to change the law. That's a big deal. Okay, this builds on really kind of a deep rupture within the church overall. So Blessed Paul VI reaffirmation that the use of artificial birth control is sinful, including use of the the birth control pill. That's a big deal. So these issues are the basic ones that really kind of divide liberal and conservative Catholics today. And this has turned into a lot of deeper divisions. Public agnosticism. Just let that term just kind of brood, okay? All right, so where are we today? Here's where we are. Pro-life advocates, we first sought a home in the Democratic Party on the assumption that its policies focused on caring for people and were consistent with Catholic social justice teaching. That was where we were. And the effort kind of continued through the mid-70s when pro-life Democrats, stymied by some feminist resistance, kind of started to migrate into the Republican Party as it slowly converted to more of a pro-life view. But you got to remember, these former Democrats then kind of adopt, Professor Shannon says, a whole range of political positions that most Catholics would have never thought of adopting because they saw them as un-Catholic, like a general endorsement of the free market, a comparative lack of concern for the poor, a tendency to blame the poor for their poverty. Those pieces. You got to remember, in the earlier times, the Catholics were the poor, and we were being blamed for poverty. Today, we're clearly divided. They're in the church, in the pew, just as we're divided in our politics. This is a big deal. The United Catholic position has a lot of difficulty finding a home in either party. And I want to be really clear about that. Our documents actually reaffirm that, especially in the United States. It should be difficult for you to find a home in either one of our political parties. Professor Shannon says the cultural positions of the church are going to offend the Democrats. The economic positions of the church are going to offend Republicans. And that's a big deal. What's troubling is that we're seeking a solution to this division more through politics than through the church itself. We're thinking if our side wins at politics, then we're going to drive the others out of the church and we'll win the church. That's disgusting. Okay, that's division. Why not focus and heal the wounds and divisions in the church first, right? Be good citizens, be involved in the political process, but do so from a united Catholic position. Listen, this is all I want to say. Your focus as a believer cannot be your political tendencies first, because who you are can't be separated from what we believe spiritually, the where we worship, the goodness that we give to God. If you're navigating kind of this like abstract external reality of like, oh, this guy, that guy, and then that drives what you hear and how you process it in the pew, let me tell you something. Your priorities are backwards. They are backwards. How about we invest in the pew first and then let the peace of that dialogue affect our politics in the parking lot? Throw it down. Throw it down, church. Let's be a generation that changes the grossness of our division. I don't care who you voted for president. I don't care. I care about your soul. I care about your heart. I care that you understand both the preferential option for the poor and the advocacy of the unborn and the death row inmate, because the doctrine is the same. Stop playing this legislature against that legislature and start selling out to the Sacred Heart, and then let your language flow from that place. Woo. Good stuff. Don't forget to visit RenovoPodcast.com for past episodes. Please subscribe to, review, and rate our podcast. We always appreciate your input. Your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments are always welcome at Doug@RenovoPodcast.com. Learn more about me on Twitter and Instagram at DTOOKE and the number 1, or visit ODBFilms.com. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.